climate change uncertainties, perception of climate risks, and the science-policy interface in climate change impacts, adaptation, and services. Welcome, Suraj. I think you have 15 minutes to present, and then we'll go into some questions for 5 minutes. So the floor is yours, but I'll probably give you 2 minutes warning if you want to, or not. I don't know. Depends how you want to do this, but I'm happy to kind of raise the hand when you're 2 minutes away. Is that okay?
And before starting, just would like to inform that we are starting the recording of this session. Let us know if there are any objection on that.
Okay, thank you, Alessandro. Okay, so Suraj, without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Marta. Thank you, Alessandro, and the rest of the MedGoal team. It's honored to talk to you a little bit about climate services over the next 15 minutes or so. So just to provide a bit of context, I guess, of where climate services are happening, I guess the backdrop of this is really that, climate variability and climate change still cause a lot of damages, deaths and destruction, from droughts to floods to storms to landslides induced by heavy rainfall, sea level rise, and so on. But as humans, we've kind of been adapting to climate variability and change for quite a long time. But, there is still an adaptation deficit. When we have a big storm, there is still damage, there is still mortality. And I guess one of the critical elements that's driving, the concept of, I guess, climate services is climate change. Anthropogenic climate change is the rate of climate change is unprecedented. You can kind of see this. This is a sort of IPC, and all, from the fifth assessment report, IPCC assessment, you can see how, if we continue to burn greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to increase global mean temperature by, possibly 4 degrees. If we actually try to reduce emissions, we could actually, achieve some sort of stabilization near the Paris Agreement of sort of 1.5. But obviously the future is still uncertain about where we're going to get to. But one thing we definitely know is this issue of the climate change commitment. So even if, we stopped emissions right now, we would still be committed to climate change simply because we have inertia in the system. And that's what actually this plot here on the right shows you. This is for sea level rise. How much would sea level rise change if you kept concentrations constant? So there's a real imperative to adapt to climate change because it's baked in. We're already committed to that, and obviously the more we mitigate, the more we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the better, obviously. But there's already going to be a certain amount of climate change, and besides, I guess, those scientific facts, we now have a lot of policy and other societal pressures that actually are forcing, stakeholders and decision makers, policymakers, to start incorporating climate change into their planning. So, just to name a few, you've got there on the slide the Paris Agreement. There's national adaptation plans. The financial institutions have got something called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure that gets them to think about what are the physical risks of climate change, and so therefore how do you adapt? And kind of those are some of the kind of impetus to for climate services more recently. So I guess a really important question really then is how does society adapt to both climate variability and change, given that there is also uncertainty about how the climate's going to change. And obviously, one of the things we can do, no doubt, is we can, have better governance, plan better. Hopefully, we'll learn from COVID in the context of planning for things that are deeply uncertain. As a society, we can reduce poverty, we can reduce inequality. So in essence, we can kind of enhance adaptive capacity, we can reduce vulnerability. But another thing we can do is start looking at the science, looking at climate science and looking at, what kind of hazards do we expect to have in the future, either in the near term or in the long term, to help us make better decisions about how to cope with both climate variability and climate change. And climate science has come a really long way. These are some plots from, again, the fifth assessment report. By the way, in the summer, you'll have access to the sixth assessment report. So you'll see some new updates then, and I can hopefully give you a bit of a flavor of things in the question and answer if you've got some questions there. But you can see, for example, this is sort of demonstrating how we've moved from kind of, lower resolution kind of climate models all the way to some very high resolution models. So, you can actually see the orography much better representation of the orography there. And even, if you go from the 70s all the way to the fifth assessment reports, you can see the increase in components that have been added to climate models. So they include atmosphere, ocean, but also carbon cycle and chemistry and so on. So, there's an increased complexity of the models to try to capture reality. And obviously, this has also been accompanied by a success in numerical weather prediction. So not all, we can now, compared to the 70s, we have a very good idea of what the weather's going to be over the next few hours, next few days, even up to a week. And so, climate models have also evolved in the same way. But a really fascinating thing that I want to tell you about is that the idea of climate services can can be traced way back. And it's, and this is something, from 1978. It's called the National Climate Act, National Climate Program Act in the US. And, the sort of the impetus for climate services is really well described here. This is the first one I was able to find, and I think this is probably one of the first few ideas of climate service here. So weather and climate change affect food production, energy, and land use, and the things that are vital to the national security and human welfare. Significant improvements in the ability to forecast climate, and information regarding climate is not being fully disseminated. And so, so in essence, they're trying to say, the United States needs to have well-defined, coordinated program in climate-related research, monitoring, assessment of the effects, and information utilization. So this, as far as I know, is probably one of the first kind of, well described description of kind of climate services for society. And it's fascinating that it goes back to kind of the 70s. But really, I guess, in the sort of more modern times, the kind of idea of climate services, I guess, was re-energized really in 2009. And Chris Hewitt, who you'll hear from, was heavily involved in a lot of this through the World Meteorological Organization. And I think he'll tell you a bit more about this. But this World Climate Conference really kind of instigated a few years of thinking and development of a global framework for climate services, where you've got, a user interface, you've got a sort of information system, you've got observations and monitoring, and you've got research as well feeding into this, all surrounded by capacity building in, national Met services across the world. So moving kind of swiftly, because I think Chris will pick this up more on the GFCS in his talk, moving swiftly a little bit to the European scene. Once the GFCS was launched sort of in 2012, the European Commission was actually quite quick at actually putting this front and center, really, of their research endeavors. So in 2015, they published this thing called the Roadmap for Climate Services. And really, there were, in essence, it's actually a massive experiment in research and development. They've essentially pumped a huge amount of funding into research to try to instigate a market of climate services. And so you can see sort of a bit of the complexity of what was attempted here. So you've got, for example, things like the Copernicus Climate Change Service that have been created, and I heard last week that they're just going to renew their contract, so they'll continue for another 4 or 5 years. So effectively, you now have an operational climate change service that includes seasonal climate forecasts. I think it might also include long-term climate change projections very soon, coming from CMIP 6. And also things that kind of, get further and further closer to decision making, such as, sectoral impact services as well, looking at energy, agriculture, tourism, and so on. So you can see it's quite a complex landscape of players. You've got government entities, you've got private sector, more and more. There are private climate service providers that are utilizing the Copernicus Climate Service to sell products to decision makers and cities and consultancies. So consultancies are important intermediaries actually translating some of this complex climate information so that actually then people can start using them. So hopefully this gives you a bit of a flavor of what the European landscape looks like. And I'm sure Alessandro and Martin, your team will talk more about this, given that, MedGold is one example of kind of, trying to translate information into usable products for the sort of agri-food sector. Now, going back to climate services and definitions, it is worth pointing out that there are really a lot of different definitions out there. I mean, I talked a bit about the Global Framework for Climate Services, which says, it's sort of climate information to assist decision-making by individuals and organizations. And I'd probably emphasize particularly, the engagement with users is particularly important. And I think this is also, a definition that's laid out by Chris Hewitt in a paper in 2012. So here are a couple of important characteristics, but you can see how, different organizations have kind of talked about this in slightly different ways. And perhaps I would maybe highlight the European Commission. Again, the roadmap is actually quite broad in its definition. So it not only, it's not just about adapting to a changing climate, but actually it includes, mitigation and disaster risk reduction. So they are thinking about it in a very broad way, and it includes many things. So, projections, forecasts, technology assessments, counseling, best practice, and so on and so forth. So you can see how the European Commission has kind of portrayed it as sort of much, much broader. But I'm predominantly talking about it in the sort of adaptation context. So how do you adapt to, both climate variability and change, to some of the adverse effects, or actually taking advantage of some of the opportunities. So there will be opportunities for people to expand, for example, agriculture in certain places, or there will be opportunities for tourism and other things. So it's not all negative as well. And so climate services can be used to maximize profits as well as reduce damages as well. Sorry?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Wow. Okay. So I'll be quite quick.
I can give you 3 if you want to.
And maybe I'll skip these slides and you'll just see the reference there. But we did some work, with a PhD student, Kathy Vaughan, looking at what do the climate services out there look like, and you can see how, there's still a lot of climate services that are very much focused on agriculture. Many climate services are particularly focused on the seasonal timescale, and maybe I'll just put this out there so I can talk a little bit about a couple of other issues. This is sort of the typical climate service, and this was a snapshot in time in 2012. So things will have changed a little bit, but a typical climate service would have been provided by a national Met service at the seasonal timescale for agricultural decision makers, probably in an online platform. So obviously there was diversity there, but that was what we found back in 2012. But that's not dissimilar to what Francesca La Rosa, who I think again will talk to you towards, I think, the end of the week or later on, they did an analysis of the research. And again, agriculture came out as one of the most important sectors, followed by energy. But I wanted to show you this because they analyzed a lot of research, and I wanted to give you a flavor of what type of institutions have been involved here. So, Columbia University has been really critical in the development of seasonal forecasts. And this goes back to, the sort of 90s with Mark Kane and Steve Ziviak kind of making the sort of first El Nino forecasts. And then that was developed by them having an institute that has been, producing seasonal climate forecasts. So you can see that, they're a really important institution that has lots of networks here, there. And then here are some of the more influential ones. So Chris has been very influential at the MetOffice. There you can see quite a core group there. And then University of Nairobi, particularly looking at the Great Horn of Africa Climate Outlook Forum as well. So you can see the type of kind of core institutions that have been developing climate services. And I think you'll hear about some of them throughout the week. Now, I want to make just a couple of extra points in my last few remaining minutes things that we've certainly, when we were writing the IPCC recently, we were trying to emphasize. One is the importance of engagement in climate services. And I really like this plot that Chris and colleagues did some years ago, which, really describes the kind of, the spectrum where you can have some very focused relationships where you have a very bespoke, you have very strong interaction between climate science and climate service providers and users of the service. So it's very iterative, and usually perhaps it's a more consultancy type relationship, but it could vary as well, up to a more interactive group discussion type approach. So for example, in the IPCC, we talk about the Future Climate for Africa project called Fractal, where they had, urban climate labs where they were bringing together climate scientists with urban planners to try to co-produce climate information in an urban setting. And here, for example, in terms of websites, you've got a classic example here is Copernicus Climate Change Service, but I'm sure you can think of other ones as well, where you're trying to cater for many users, and the focus is on kind of catering for kind of the many people. So I think on the interest of time, I'll probably skip this one, or maybe just to say, you'll have access to these slides, but one of the things I guess that comes up is that depending on how you kind of, there are different types of climate services there. Firstly, because of the different types of engagements with users, but also depending on whether you're trying to do something, again, for many, generic, and so you go down the route of web kind of services or Atlas. The IPCC is going to have an Atlas, for example, has had one in AR5 and will have one in AR6. But then on this other end, you've got things that are much more customized. You've got a customer, a particular company that wants an answer to a particular question. So that's going to give you a slightly different, much more tailored, much more bespoke climate service. And then the other axis I think that's quite important is the level of kind of how important is climate in the climate service. So is it predominantly driven by climate as a driver, or is it actually integrated where you bring in other socioeconomic aspects, maybe you bring in some environmental aspects, and so you're actually trying to provide a much more holistic service to the customer. So those are kind of some of the ways we try to kind of explain the climate service landscape. And by the way, this comes from the I think it was EU Max Horizon, the 2020 project. So again, if you find this reference, you can find out some more. Now, you can do all these things. You can do as much co-production as possible, and try to get users and providers together. But at the end of the day, there could still be barriers, and I think hopefully Marta will pick this up later in the week. There will still be barriers, and I think one does need to recognize that, and there are challenges. So this plot is something we did in Europe for the Aporius project that Chris coordinated, and you can see, there are uncertain, there are barriers associated to low skill, at the seasonal time scale, or the reliability of forecasts, or just uncertainty. We just don't know because there are limits to predictability, for example. But the good thing is there are enablers, and some of the enablers we found in Europe was the interaction with producers. That really helps. There are other things that you can find in that paper. So I'll just finish off with a few challenges, because as I said, we can try to do as much co-production as we can, but there are still some challenges to do with uncertainty. But also there are some kind of newer challenges, I think, around the governance of climate services, because in essence, there is now a huge amount of climate information out there. So for the user, there is the big question, what is the quality climate service? Is it the climate data factory? Is it the Med project? Is it the Copernicus Climate Change Service? Is it my National Met Service? So there's some pretty big questions about, where does one go and get this information? Huge questions now around the ethics of climate services, and particularly, what is quality and what is, perhaps not so much quality climate services. And ultimately, I think this question about evaluation is going to come up, because the onus is almost in climate service providers to demonstrate, that there is value in these climate services, and therefore people should be either paying money for this, or or if it's free, why should people be using this? So there is onus to kind of demonstrate this to the user, and I think those are maybe some of the kind of critical challenges that are still in this kind of very much emerging field. So I'll stop there, Marta, and take any questions. Apologies if I went over.
Thank you. Thanks, Raj. That was very comprehensive. I can hear myself, so I hope there's not much of an echo. Are there any questions or comments for Suraj? We still have a couple of minutes we can maybe use. Actually, well, if no one has any question, I would like to maybe ask Suraj. So what is the latest from, the sixth assessment report that we can expect in the summer? What are the key, what are the key messages that are coming through? I know you're involved in one of the working groups, so maybe you could highlight us what will be the latest in terms of climate services, and perhaps some of your slides already reflect some of these key points, but can you maybe elaborate a bit on what can we expect?
Yeah, sure. The sixth assessment report is quite unique in that it's the first report that has quite a lot of focus on regional climate information. So there are 3 chapters that focus on the regional aspects. So chapter 10 looks particularly at methods. So you will find there, concepts around distillation, how to, produce regional climate information. Chapter 11 focuses a little bit more on the extremes. And then chapter 12, which I was involved in, focuses on regional climate information for risk and impact assessment. And so it tries to translate climate information into hazard metrics that are decision relevant and particularly, of relevance to Working Group 2. And that's really where climate services get discussed. I can share with you that I guess, it was quite a challenge to do an assessment, I guess, partly because, I guess the IPCC focuses particularly on the peer review literature. And a lot of the climate service material is in the gray literature. So what the chapter does is it kind of lays out the landscape, a little bit as I did today here with you. And then it tries to provide some of the core elements, I guess, of climate services, such as, user engagement. It talks about the different types of climate services. And then it does discuss some of the challenges that are still yet to be kind of overcome. And it certainly portrays, climate services as a real opportunity, right? I mean, it's a fantastic opportunity for science to inform decision making. And then, by the way, I mean, Working Group 2 then picks this up as well. So, I mean, Working Group 1 will be published in the summer, but Working Group 2 will be later, probably, I think, early next year. And so Working Group 2 talks about, climate services as a risk management strategy. So if you have climate services, you can better manage your risks. And so they'll have some sections that talk about that. And again, emphasis on, the evidence, I guess, shows that, if we co-produce climate services between scientists and users, you increase the usability. But, some of that evidence is certainly limited. And I think we need to build that evidence more to better know, how do we create effective climate services that are usable. And I think that literature is still kind of growing. But certainly Working Group 2, I think will be saying that, the co-production of climate services will lead to better risk management, climate risk management.
Okay, thank you so much, Suraj. So, and we will be touching upon more about this idea of co-production and what it actually means in the context of climate services later on in the Living Lab. So you'll be hearing more about that. Thank you so much, Suraj. If there is no further questions, I'll pass on then to my colleague, Michael, who will be introducing Chris Hewitt for the next presentation. Thank you.
Oh, hello then. Right, I'll briefly introduce Chris. So Chris is currently head of international climate services at the MetOffice and also a professor of climate science at the University of Southern Queensland in Australia. He collaborates around the world on developing and delivering climate services and leads or has led a number of European projects. He's been heavily involved in developing the global framework for climate services and has been co-chair of the World Meteorological Organization expert teams on climate service user engagement. He's currently co-chair of the expert team on climate information for decision making. We'll hear about some of these activities from Chris now.
Chris, I don't think that your sharing screen works.
No, okay. It didn't.
I could share my screen and just.
Please do. I tried one more time, but it didn't work. Thank you. Please do, Alessandro. Thanks, Mike. While you're getting that up, so yes, like Suraj, I'm honoured to be able to talk to you all. I feel I should have gone first. Suraj is a very hard act to follow. He's covered an awful lot of information, as Marta just commented. So there will be a little bit of overlap in some of these slides. So we may get back on time. I'm not going to talk about IPCC though, so there is a complete distinction there. But so lots of the points that Suraj has raised, I will also reiterate those. But they're important points, so I think that's okay. But apologies that some of this will be building on what Suraj has said. So I'll try and give some different messages around those things. So the next slide, please. I will give a quick overview of the landscape of climate services. So this will be a slightly different perspective to Suraj, so that's good. Suraj's history was fascinating. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to that. Thank you. I'll focus on some global activities, as Suraj said, so I will talk a bit about the global framework for climate services. And then I was asked to actually give a specific example. So I'll give an example from work we've been doing in China, looking at building resilience to climate-related risks. So next slide, please. So it's been clear from Suraj's talk and work you're all doing. Climate information, it is being used in decision-making and risk management all around the world, and it has been for a long time in various forms. And as Suraj said, since I guess World Climate Conference 3 in 2009, the phrase climate services has become more and more of a mainstream phrase. But climate services have been provided for a long time. So yes, there are multiple definitions. I suggest we don't get into a debate about a definition, but just as some scope. So I see them as being around providing climate information to assist decision making, exactly as Suraj was saying. And there are various things. They do need to respond to user needs, and Suraj pointed out the importance of the engagement with the the users, the decision makers. So I will come back to that. And there's a range of different users of these services: policymakers, decision makers, governments, national or local or at the sort of European scale, public sector, private sector, general public, academia. There's a long list of users of this climate information. They should be based, as Suraj said at the end there, I fully agree, on scientifically credible information and expertise. So there are issues around ethics and quality and evaluation. And there needs to be an appropriate engagement between the users of the service and the providers of the service. And since that is important, I will touch on that later. Next slide, please. Suraj gave us a very good summary of work done showing the range of uses of climate information and climate services. I don't know how well you can all see this slide here, but it's sometimes helpful to think of these in slightly different timescales. There are grey areas and overlap, but it's the decision makers trying to understand the decisions they're making and what timescales of interest they're interested in. And so the figure on the right, sorry, the font is very small, it is on my screen. The figure on the right gives examples of sort of sectors or decision makers on this range of timescales. So I split it up into 3 timescales. You could split it up different ways, but just to illustrate this. So it's interesting on Suraj's diagram, it doesn't show up, but I think the past climate, based on observations and monitoring of climate and climatologies, is the most important timescale. All of the other timescales pretty much are going to rely on understanding something about a baseline or current vulnerability and exposure to climate hazards. So the past climate is very important, and often we get excited about the future, and that's what shows up in these studies. But the past is in my view, essential. People understanding their vulnerability to current or past climate hazards, or for scenario planning, as shown on this diagram, so looking forward to the future. But then on the future, I've split this into 2 timescales. As I said, you could split it into more if you wanted, but just to illustrate this. So there's the near-term future climate, so looking out to the coming months and seasons, perhaps out to several years ahead, out to maybe a decade. In terms of the capability that these services are based on, they're often based on climate predictions. So like seasonal forecasts would be an example of a climate prediction. We're trying to predict the evolution of the climate into the future. And there's a range of uses for this. Suraj touched on some of these as well. So aid agencies are very interested, people involved in market trading, resource planning for whatever it might be, agriculture or energy or water, planning for operations and things. So that's a very important timescale. And then there's a lot of interest, particularly when we talk about adaptation and mitigation of climate change, on the longer term future climate. So these services are often based on multi-decadal climate projections, so such as CMIP, as Suraj mentioned, CMIP 5 or CMIP 6. And here there are interests from mitigation, people dealing with mitigation policies, people involved in large infrastructure projects, so planning for large infrastructure projects, obviously adaptation to climate change. But as I said, often there's some grey areas, and so some decision makers are interested in a range of these timescales. So adaptation, for example, looking forward to the coming months and seasons is being seen now increasingly as a very useful way to understand adapting to longer term climate change. And the note at the bottom, often there's an overlap with weather services. So maybe a lot of decision makers are interested in something about the coming season and months, and then trying to blend that into a weather service. So those are the timescales. Next slide, please. So this climate service landscape is very busy. There are some global activities underway, particularly the Global Framework for Climate Services, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the Climate Services Partnership. So the Global Framework is something done under the United Nations system involving governments around the world, fairly formal, but the Climate Services Partnership is very informal. So anybody around the world can get involved in this very easily. Feel free to Google Climate Services Partnership. And it's bringing a community together because they want to work on things, sharing good practice, whatever it might be. At the national or regional scale, so by regional, I mean multinational, sorry, not within a nation, but across nations. Obviously, you're involved in this. There's lots of activities. Europe, as Suraj said, has really got into this space in a very impressive way. So there's the Horizon 2020 activities, and coming soon, the Horizon Europe activities, the Climate Kick, the JPI Climate, the Copernicus Climate Change Service. So Europe's very active, but around the world, there are other regional groupings and national groupings. So for example, regionally, on the other sort of monthly to seasonal timescale, there are things called regional climate outlook forums in various parts of the world. They're very active, and they bring groups together to collaborate and to form partnerships. If you click one more, please. Thank you. And then Suraj has mentioned this, so this does link to IPCC. There's been major advances in the climate science that's been developed and is being used for the climate services. big advances in the monitoring, predicting and understanding of climate change, where we're now getting more and more detail, assessing uncertainty, undertaking risk assessments, etc. A particular note is the seasonal forecasting capability has advanced a lot in recent times, and also the use of those seasonal forecasts in decision making, for example, particularly in agriculture. Thank you. The next slide. So it's great that Suraj showed this. I don't need to talk through this very quickly then if you click again. So there are these different components on this diagram. So the vision of this global framework is to enable society to manage better risks and opportunities arising from climate variability and climate change. So there are lots of risks, but there are also opportunities in taking on board climate information for decision making. But just to reiterate that the key part of this is the user engagement, the dotted elliptical shape there. So engaging between the users of the services and the people who have the capability, the knowledge, the information, and providing the services. So that's a key part. And the next slide, I was very pleased, if you click again, and one more. Wasn't expecting to see this in your talk, Suraj. It's brilliant. Thank you very much for giving a shout out to this. So the WMO fully recognised the importance of this user engagement, and there was a Commission for Climatology team, international expert team that had the fortune to lead on user engagement for climate services, where we were tasked with getting an international group together to identify and evaluate examples of user engagement. So we got examples from all around the world, spent a lot of time analysing them and trying to identify some good practice and providing case studies. So the green document in the middle there is a WMO publication on this. It's quite a long publication. And on the left, as Suraj said, we did a shorter summary. We published in Nature Climate Change on this to then come up with the main headline, as Suraj rightly identified, the diagram on the right, a stairway to heaven or whatever it might be called, where there are very different levels of engagement. It depends very much on the needs of the decision maker. Also, sadly, often the funding. So as Suraj said at the top, it may be services provided by consultancies, and these are often typically at some sort of cost and maybe a considerable cost. But at the bottom, so it's called passive engagement, the first step on this. And for a lot of people, that's probably all they need. So a website, some web tools, receiving information through a website. The Copernicus Climate Change Service is a good example. So there's a lot of really useful information available through that website, and there are other examples around the world. And so for some people, that's an appropriate level of engagement, but we tried to illustrate here there are different levels of engagement. So next slide, I'll now move on to the specific example. So we've been doing a lot of work in China on developing climate services in China. We're working with the China Meteorological Administration, which is the equivalent of, well, it's the National Met Service in China, and the Institute of Atmospheric Physics in China, part of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and various universities. And then on the UK side, this is a collaboration between the UK and China. We have a range of UK universities, the MetOffice, so Leeds University with Suraj and Marta, they're involved in this, the UK MetOffice. So we have this collaboration, which we've been doing for about 5 or 6 years. And this is one example of an area where we've been very successful with the climate services side and the engagement. So back in 2016, we started to develop a trial seasonal rainfall forecast service for the Yangtze River Basin. And so the figure there, hope you can see a red star and the blue river going above that and below that. So that's the Yangtze River, the blue river. And the red star is the Three Gorges Dam, which at the time was the world's largest hydropower dam. It may still be the largest, I'm not sure, but it's certainly one of the largest if it's not the largest. And we work very closely with the Three Gorges Corporation and the China Yangtze Power Company. So these are the decision makers. These are the end users of climate information, really. They use the climate information to help them make their decisions on how to operate this dam and other dams along the Yangtze River. So the dam is there, it has several responsibilities. So primarily, I think it'd be fair to say it's flood control. So before the dam was built, there have been catastrophic floods of the Yangtze River. The numbers of people that have died in records are quite mind-boggling compared to what we have in Europe. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people have died in the past through flooding on the Yangtze River. So the dam is primarily there to control floods. It can't eliminate floods, but to try and limit the destruction. It is a large dam on a large river, so there's a huge body of water behind it. So it's also there to produce power. So its other primary function is power production. So it's a major producer of hydropower, and there are other dams on the river as well that produce hydropower. excuse me, and then also they need to maintain the quality of the water supply, and it's an important source of navigation on the river. So we produce a seasonal forecast for average rainfall and river flow in the river basin. We disseminate this through the China Meteorological Administration, and then they disseminate it through their regional climate center in Wuhan, which we're probably all familiar with now. We probably can roughly guess where that is. It's slightly to the right of that red star. And what happened was we actually visited the dam early in 2015, 2016. If you could just jump back so I could remind myself of the words. You jump back one slide, please.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. We visited the dam late in 2015, and the seasonal forecasts at that time were all looking that it was going to be a strong El Nino throughout the 2015-2016 season. And historically, strong El Ninos in this region have been associated with large flooding on the Yangtze River. At the same time, there was a paper published through this partnership between the UK and China on predictability of river flow and rainfall in the Yangtze River basin. So we had this rather nice situation where we had a lot of interest in the information, climate information, especially with a possible flood season coming up. And we had scientific capability that looked like it could provide useful information. So next slide, please. So we then undertook this diagram on the left showing how we then decided to go about developing a prototype climate service. So this isn't an operational climate service. Operational climate services in China are clearly the remit of the Chinese National Met Service, CMA, not the UK Met Office or UK universities. So it's a prototype. And the first stage of this, number one, is to explore the user needs. So we were lucky to then be invited in May of 2016 to a meeting in Wuhan. They have monthly meetings. I think it's February, March, April, May. They bring together the decision makers, the people operating the dams, for example, in the river basin. They bring together the climate service providers, some scientists. And there's a picture there of the meeting. You sit in a conference room. It's all in Chinese, but sit in a meeting room and discuss the seasonal forecast that's being expected for the coming flood season. So we were invited to that, which is excellent. So we got to hear what the needs were from the decision makers for the climate information. We then had this scientific capability and this interest. So the second stage, we exploit perhaps is a harsh word, but we built on this scientific capability and developed a prototype climate service. And we then had a chance to use that climate service to then engage with the actual decision makers and the beneficiaries of that service. So step 3, exposing this prototype to the users. I'll just quickly say them now, and then we'll jump forward. So the next steps will then be examine that service and expand on the service, and then keep going round. So the next slide, please. And then, thank you. So in terms of examining the service and verification, there's scientific verification done, but in this case, the verification was pretty clear in the news. There were numerous news reports. The prototype was talking about a wetter than average summer flood season, and the river did flood. Not catastrophically, the dam did its job, but there was flooding and there was a lot of water building up behind the dam. So a level of verification for this was relatively easy. We could just see it in the news headlines that it was indeed a very heavy flood season. So then we needed to examine this service and see how we could improve it. So next slide, please. So here we were very fortunate. So the photo there shows some Met Office staff who have been working on this, and we had visitors from the Three Gorges Corporation come over to Exeter in the UK to spend 3 days with us. It was amazing. So technical staff representing the decision makers to hear about the scientific capability that was going into the service, hear about the service itself, explain what their needs were, how we were meeting some of those needs and where we were not meeting those needs. And we had a very open and honest discussion about what we thought we could do, what we thought we couldn't do, and what we thought we could try and do through some more development. So we then developed some more scientific capability, and we revised the service, and then we sort of issued a new service. And in this case, it's providing information at slightly better spatial scale for them. So providing information above the dam and below the dam. And we now keep iterating around with the users to try and improve this as far as we can while maintaining our scientific credibility. They understand we can't give them exactly what they would really like. Climate information has its challenges and uncertainties, but we're making progress. We're slowly but surely providing more useful information. Next slide, please. If you click maybe 4 clicks, I guess. Keep going, keep going. One more. Thank you. So it was good to see Suraje's challenges. I've come up with a different list, which is excellent news. So I've noted yours down, Suraj, and I may add some of yours to mine and delete some of these, but it's good. So I see some slightly different challenges. I agree with all of Suraj's. And there's some overlap, but the challenges we found, particularly in this China example, but other services we do as well, there's a big gap between the requirements of the decision makers and the scientific capability that we have. And we have to just be honest about that gap, and we have to strive to try and narrow that gap as best as we can, or find other ways around that gap. Language is a fascinating one. We often talk different technical language, the different communities, but also in this China example and around Europe, we have different native tongues, and some words have a very different meaning. And we found that in China culturally. I think Uncertainty, with Suraj's team, did a study on this. There's some very different understanding of language. Users is an interesting concept that's discussed a lot. Who are the users? What do they need? How do you engage with them? And that is a challenge, undoubtedly. Who are the providers? Often they are national Met services, but not always. And the national Met service may not be the most appropriate provider, or there could be important collaborations to provide a more useful service. Sustainability, so turning these pilots or these prototypes into something more operational, that is a big challenge. You're working here on a project, I work on lots of projects. When the project finishes, what do you do? There's a danger that all the work you've done gets lost, and so there's a challenge there. And finally, the capabilities and the capacities. How do we develop the capabilities and capacities, both of the providers and the users of these services? Thank you. I think the next slide is the final one. Next slide, thank you. So that was all I was going to say. Thank you for listening. Happy to take questions if there are any.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for Chris?
I have a quick question, if it's possible. Very simple question. Is this service that you have showed there with China and them are still ongoing? Is operational now, or is just a level of prototype?
So it's ongoing. We haven't moved it into operational stage yet. So that is, as I said, that is a challenge. And in particular with this example in China, we're not the operational climate service provider in China. So that's an extra step of complication, which is an unfortunate example. So if we take it back to Europe with your activities and with our activities, then yes, I think it's easier to move prototypes and trials into operations. But to answer your question, no, this is slightly more complicated when you're working in collaboration with others. So it's really not our remit to turn this into an operational service. So what they do in China is they take this information and use it in their operational services. So they take this service and add it to what they're already doing. We'll be having discussions over the coming year or two as to what we could do better or differently. It's a good question.
Thank you. I see your hand raised by Tony. Please, Tony. Tony, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Chris. This was a really interesting overview. I was wondering, you mentioned language as a challenge, and I bet, especially working in China, it might have been a problem for you guys coming from Europe. Could you talk a little bit about that? How you bridged that? How you were able to communicate with people?
Yes.
Thanks.
So specifically on the language, not technical. So yes, it's a challenge.
Well,
there's just no way around it.
I guess sort of both.
Okay, it is both. So yes, I'll cover both ends. So typically, the people we work with at the Chinese Meteorological Administration, they do speak English. I don't speak Chinese, so it is awkward. But in China, they do speak English. The scientists are working in an international community, so I guess that's the nature. Their English is a lot better than my Chinese. So at the sort of the technical level with the scientists and the service providers, language isn't such a barrier, but there are still some different uses of terminology which are a challenge, and we think we're saying something which is going to have the same meaning and it doesn't, and we have fallen foul of that. And Suraj and Marta may want to say more about this as well from their experiences. But in terms of when we get to the sort of more decision maker end and the policy maker end, it's all done through translation. So we will give like a presentation like this, and I'll say, I don't know, 1 minute's worth of text, and the translator will then translate it, and you have no idea what the translator is now saying, how they've interpreted what you've said. And then you get through your presentation or point, whatever point you're making, if it's a meeting, the discussion point, You then have a reply, and again, it's translated. So you're relying on the translator there to understand your language and terminology. But it's proven really successful. So it has been a challenge, but it's not given us any cause to fail or to be a problem. It's just we need to be aware of this as a challenge. It's not a impossible challenge to get over. It slows everything down. It does take a lot longer, but maybe that's good. I mean, I'm talking very fast now. I'm sorry, and maybe that's not a good thing. So talking slower and doing things slower could be a good thing. But yeah, so we do it through translators who do understand quite a lot of the background to the capability that we're talking about, the science, but also the decision makers as well. We've been very fortunate with the people we've had to do the translation. Does that answer your question, Tony?
It does, yeah. Thanks a lot.
It's fun though. It's really good fun. I love it.
I can just add to Chris's comment, because I did a number of interviews in China as well as part of the project I was involved. We use translators. We were basically talking with people from different government agencies across China and also across private sector companies and things like that. We normally prep the translators beforehand, so they are aware of the kind of questions we want to make. And we also explain certain things that they might not understand. But ultimately, one of the immediate things I realized was that, for example, they find it difficult to distinguish between weather and climate timescales. So we had to further explain what we meant by, for example, seasonal forecasts. So it requires a bit more explanation and making sure that they understand what we're asking. It takes a bit more time, but it has been very successful and productive. It just requires us being aware of where there might be, for the challenges in terms of understanding, so we don't get lost in translation kind of thing. But yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, Marty, you raise a very good point, which is relevant maybe to the rest of your discussions. Yeah, that this weather and climate issue, it's a big issue, especially as you said in China, we found this. So we were driven check this out, we were driven to an offshore wind farm, amazing. Only in China can you be driven to an offshore wind farm. And we spent time with the wind farm operators, and they constantly wanted to hear about weather. And we had to it was quite embarrassing. We had to keep on saying, well, we're actually talking about climate in this, and we spent a lot of time trying to explain that. So then we spent a lot of that time trying to, I guess, translate to understand how climate information could be useful to them. So month, season, whatever it might be. And they did have an interest, but it was hard work getting to that interest. And the natural instinct often was to think about the coming few days. They thought it was all about weather services. So maybe there's something there with the word weather and climate, Marta, in Chinese, how it translates, I don't know. But it was much harder work to try and get onto the climate timescale. But when we did, we found really useful information out. Thanks for pointing that out, Marta.
Thank you. I see her hand raised by Suraje, I suppose. I'm right?
Yes. Is it okay to ask a question, Alessandro?
Yeah, sure.
Great. Thanks. Thanks so much, Chris. That was really good to get your overview on that. One quick question I had, I guess, is just something that came out in the news today, and so it reminded me. So, the MetOffice and other agencies were talking about, global temperature exceeding 1.5 degrees globally, and that's really emanating from this decadal kind of prediction, global annual decadal climate updates, and so the MetOffice is the leading agency for WMO on that area, and it's something like the IPCC 6th assessment report won't be saying much about that, just as it doesn't say much about seasonal. But we've talked quite a lot about seasonal today and long-term climate change as well, and people can see that in AR6. I wondered if you could say a little bit about, just annual to decadal climate prediction. I mean, based on your conversations with your colleagues and, EUCP and your state of, knowledge of the science. I mean, what are the prospects for, I guess, skillful annual to decadal predictions at the regional level?
Great question. I could talk for hours on this, but I won't. So yes, there's some people call it the sweet spot, don't they? So I guess it depends on your perspective. So as I showed on those timescales, what we're now talking about is the bit in the middle, the overlap area. So there's the multi-decadal timescales, largely around adaptation and mitigation, and then there are the sort of seasonal, the climate variability timescale in the middle, the monthly to interannual variability. And I think, Suraje, you're asking about this just beyond the multi-annual. So 5, 10, 15, 20 years timescale, if I understand. You're nodding good. So yes, there's a lot of interest from decision makers and policy makers on those timescales. And on the capability side, which I think is what you asked, if we're honest, that's emerging capability. So we're in this situation where we've got to be very careful, in my view, that we don't over-excite or over-enthuse decision makers where they think we're suddenly going to be able to give them information on that timescale. We've got to be very careful. So the people, Adam Scaife, for example, so the people who are involved in producing those predictions are very cautious about how their information is used. They don't want it to be inappropriately used. Back to your point about ethics and quality and evaluation. They do a lot on the evaluation of the predictions, but evaluating the services, as you said, is going to be more difficult. So we've got to be very careful, in my view. And I think we're treading quite slowly in that space, and I think we should carry on doing that. Then maybe, if I was being a bit cheeky and naughty, there could be space for some people out there to perhaps go a bit faster and try a few things out. I don't think we'll do that at the Met Office, but some people might want to do that. It's risky. We don't want to get into an ethical problem there where there's inappropriate things being doing, but there could be some discoveries made. So I'm rambling now, but yeah, that's a really good timescale, and I think we should be cautious. We should look at that capability. We should see, as you said, there'll be probably already out there an announcement today about the long-range predictions, the multi-annual predictions, multi-decadal, and we should see how decision makers and policy makers react to that and try and understand. I guess it was that spiral I showed. We've got some capability we can explore, spend time with the decision makers and policy makers, the co-development that either Suraj or Marta mentioned, I think it was you, Suraj, the co-development, and we should explore that space, but carefully. I don't know what you think. What do you think? Turn it back to you, Suraj. And you said IPCC aren't touching this, but I presume they'll have to touch it next time.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for sending it back. I've put the link in the chat so everyone can see. So yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, I obviously need to study this document in a bit more detail. I guess my impression is that what colleagues have done is they've been communicating this, particularly at the global level, particularly to kind of talk about Paris compliance in essence, and yeah, so I kind of have the mitigation side of things. But I mean, I think all of us know that decision makers are very interested in the next year and in the next 5 years. And I was particularly talking about the next 10 years, really. I guess what's known as decadal prediction. So I can't quite say on the spot now, but I think this document that you can kind of access through that link actually starts talking about regional. So there's global indices, that's fine. I think we've seen that. But then regional prediction for 2021 to 2025, and I need to go and read up on it. But I certainly agree with you that yeah, we need to explore this with stakeholders, and yeah, one does need to be cautious because it is about reliability, and I guess, yeah, I mean, again, maybe something to mention now is that decision makers have been burned by seasonal forecasts that have gone wrong, and again, evidence in the literature shows that you can lose trust on these type of products very easily, and it's difficult to gain back the trust. So I think I'll probably echo that caution that you've put there, Chris, in terms of kind of it's probably about communicating that this is somewhat experimental still, and it's still being explored in the research domain. It could have huge potential, but we're not there yet. So that's probably where I'm at. But I need to read up a bit more on this. And Alessandro, I'd be curious to know whether MedGold itself is looking at that timescale.
Well, no, regarding MedGold, we covered the traditional time scale, so in terms of seasonal and long term, but in our experience, we seen that there is for sure a strong interest in the shorter time scale, quite close to the weather forecast. And so the shorter the better for the users, at least in our experience in MedGold in the agricultural sector. While for the longer time scales, there is mostly a matter of long-term investment, so it could be something just for large companies and something for policymakers and something like this. But the main interest of users in MedGold in the agricultural sector is on the shorter time scale, for sure. So we have followed this.
Do I have time to make a comment, Alessandro? I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
Just quickly. So with my other job, so I work at University of Southern Queensland in Australia, and we're doing a big project in Southeast Asia on agriculture. And there we are looking at the multi-annual timescale and decadal as a sort of a route towards climate change adaptation. I did mention it in my talk briefly, but it's a very useful way of engaging with farmers, for example, to try and then start to explain how climate information can be of use to them, and then expand that conversation into looking further ahead in terms of ultimately climate change and how a changing climate on longer terms could affect their industry. And I'm sure that'll be the same with MedGold as well. The people you're engaging with, there's a longer term. Is issue too strong a word? There's something else coming in the future. So IPCC will tell us more, as Suraje says, in the summer. But we already know. So it's being seen, this shorter timescale, seasonal to multi-annual, is a very good way of sort of engaging and discussing with the farmers or other people in the agriculture sector, and then also looking further out into the future.
Thank you, Chris. Now, you're completely right. I would like to leave the floor to Margherita, that I see that has her hand raised, and otherwise it's just a discussion between us, and I would like to leave some room to our attendants. Please, Margherita.
It's just a quick question. You hear me?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I would like to ask Chris if you are aware or you are involved in any project running like this to provide services regarding fires control.
On climate timescales, so weather timescales, yes. On climate timescales, I think there are some European projects, so excuse me that I can't remember their names. I'm not involved, no. But there are some projects in Europe, or at least there were, under Horizon 2020. I'm embarrassed that I can't remember the name of them. So there are some projects that are looking at fire on the climate timescales. Yes, I'm not involved, though, is the answer to your question. But there are projects that are doing that, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe a Google search might tell you, because like I say, I'm embarrassed that I can't remember the name of them. So perhaps if you do a Google search.
Okay. I don't know if there are any other questions or comments for Chris and Suraje as well. Okay. Oh, Antonio, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. So mine was just a note or a comment about this the scheme of agriculture, because I was wondering if Professor Hewitt and Dessai consider also as users what can be the civil protection or also engineers in general, since flood or also fire risk, as Anna was talking about before, is something that concerns also this sector. What I mean is that, okay, probably the period that we consider forecast for our assessment, risk assessment of territorial, is a bit different from what you consider in agriculture. But still, this can be, I think, something interesting also as a service that can be provided to these other fields in the risk assessment of fire or also flood. So I don't know if Professor Hewitt and Dessai consider this possibility. It's something out of maybe the topic of this lab, but I was wondering this. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if it's my internet or yours, Antonio. I couldn't hear everything you said, but yes, there are a whole range of other interests and potential users of this information. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. Like I said, I'm sorry, it might be my internet. So yes, there are a range of users and interests. Suraj, did you hear better? Was it my internet?
No.
I can't hear anyone.
I think you're all
Can you hear me? Oh, can you hear me, Chris?
No, you're really worrying me. I couldn't hear anybody. I thought my internet had gone down completely.
No. I'm just adding that Antonio is mentioning also as a potential actor and potential users some institution like the civil protection or something like this. Yes. And if you, in your experience, you have had some relationship with and some links with these kind of actors.
Okay, yes. So I haven't, but colleagues have. So yes, civil protection is indeed a grouping of people that are using this sort of information that get engaged with. I'm not sure if Suraj has a different experience. Suraj, do you?
No, likewise, yeah. I mean, I haven't particularly interacted with them as a community, but they are heavily engaged in this area, definitely. So, you know, they keep an eye on early warning systems, and I mean, I guess one very interesting concept that you'll see in the literature and has been developed is this concept of forecast-based financing. So, you know, like the Red Cross uses forecasts of seasonal forecasts really of kind of high intensity rainfall or droughts to essentially get financing ahead of the disaster so that they can then disperse it very quickly. So that's used operationally now by the Red Cross, Red Crescent. So that's an example of a sort of civil kind of contingency organization that is making full use of seasonal forecasts to inform their decision making. But then, in Europe, I think some civil contingency organizations are also using that information, you know, to help prepare. But I don't know. It's not something I've worked in, so I don't know to what extent they're using it. To the extent how much they're using it.
Okay, I don't know if there are any other comments for Chris and Suraje, because time is running out and maybe it's time to close this first session. Okay, so if there are any other comments, I would like very warmly to thank Chris and Suraje for their very inspirational and very comprehensive landscape about climate service. I think it's very good for an introductory session like this, and could be a very good starting point for our work in the Living Lab. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks
You're welcome.
for having us. All right.
Yes. Bye.
Finally, I would like just to close this session. Just let me remind the next appointment. And this afternoon, if you want, we'll have a MedGold drink in the general room. Please bring with you some MedGold drink and snacks, so we could chat all together. With a good glass of wine or something like this. And the first hands-on session, we'll meet the problem holders, discover the problem, and work with the teams next Monday at 2 p.m. Central Europe Summer Time, again in the general room. And however, we'll send a reminder send by chat and by email, and please have a look at our web repository, because we'll update all the contents in the afternoon. Just to reply to the chat, it's never too early for a glass of wine, for sure. And yes. I'm joking, for sure. But however, if we could have also some wine without alcohol, as European Union has suggested recently. And okay, thank you very much for all your contribution and for this quite interesting session. I will meet again or this afternoon for the drink or in the first hands-on session on Monday afternoon. I would like to ask to the organizer if you can just remain a few minutes after the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. See
Thank
you
you.
later.
Thank you.